Welcome to the Project Manager Power Hour, where we are so efficient that we can deliver 1 hour worth of content in just under 30 minutes. My name is Xavier Billingsley. I am the CEO of Hudson Consulting, where we specialize in staffing project managers, project coordinators, and program managers, as well as portfolio managers within the healthcare and insurance industries. Ready for another amazing episode? Let's go. All right, guys. So today we are going to dive into risk management. I know this is your favorite subject. I get it. It's one of mine too. But we're going to talk about it. One thing about risk management is that if you do it well, it'll save you a whole lot of issues, a lot of headaches. It'll just make your life much easier. At EH Hudson, we focus on our project managers managing projects proactively and not being reactive. So one of the best ways to manage your projects proactively is being really really good at risk management. And trust me, if you can do this well, it'll save you a lot of headaches. It'll save your team a lot of headaches, and actually it'll save you a lot of time, because if you're reactive all the time and you're always behind the ball with addressing risks, and even some that you may be aware that may even potentially happen, but if you didn't document them during the planning phase and you don't have a plan of attack, guess what happens? All of a sudden you have to drop everything you're doing, pull your team off of the work that they're currently doing, just so that you can come up with a plan to address this risk that may potentially impact the project's overall objective. Is that smart? No, no, it isn't smart. Um, do a lot of us do it as project managers? Yes, we do. A lot of us consider it to be a badge of honor to be able to put out fires. We become excellent firefighters. But the truth of the matter is if you pull together a good plan in the beginning, you have contingency plans, strategies for addressing certain risks and issues, it makes your life easier, as I mentioned earlier. Okay. Now we look here. We talked about better to be proactive than reactive. When you're being reactive, as I mentioned, it really takes a lot of time. Project managers is a high stress job if you're doing your job well. And if you can minimize the amount of risk that you have to go through on a daily basis, then why not do it? Why not do it? And this is one of the best ways to do it. In If you can be proactive and get in front of issues ahead of time, you already have a plan, your team already know what to do. It's just a matter of just saying, okay, this has happened. This is what we're going to do to address this issue, corral the troops, and get it done. All right. Now, for today, for risk management, what I want to talk about is one, we're going to dive a little bit more into what is risk management. Then from there, we're going to dive into the risk management processes based on PMI and when to do these specific processes during the project management life cycle. And then finally, we're going to dive into how do we even communicate project risk? What's the change management process? How do we present to executives? How do we escalate? Which risks do we escalate? So we're going to dive into all of that. So the PMI definition of risk management is you have all these activities are applied to project management. Project risk defined by PMI as an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on the project's objective. Another definition is the project risk management may begin in recognizing the threat or by examining an opportunity. In a nutshell, that's risk management. So, what is the risk management process? The very first thing you do is you plan your risk management. Then you get with your team and you identify the threats or risks. You perform a qualitative risk analysis. After a qualitative risk analysis, you perform a quantitative risk analysis, and then you plan your risk response, which is my favorite part to do. All right, so what I want to do is as I walk through each one of these processes, I'm going to actually bring up um, a risk register that I used for years. And by the way, if you're interested in this risk register, if it's something you think you can leverage and use in your projects, then I will actually have a link at the bottom of the YouTube link, or if you're listening to the podcast, then just go to ehhudson.com, go to candidate resources, and then you can click the link and you will have access to this risk register as well as some other templates that I have available. And I'm pretty much constantly populating our database with different templates that people can use. All right. So this is a risk register that I use. So the very first thing we talked about, the very first process is to pull together a risk management plan. So this is a process of establishing a common understanding of the parameters or metrics as it relates to managing risk for the project. What does that look like? That means you get together with a small subset of people, and to me, those people should be those folks in leadership roles, not executives, but those people who are maybe um, indirectly like project leads, developer leads, those types of folks, plus yourself, and then you get together, and it probably take about an hour meeting, if that, 30 minutes to an hour, and you guys come up with the metrics that you want to use as far as to for managing your risk. So this will include like your risk tolerance. What is your risk score? So you're going to have your risk small, sorry, not small, low, medium, high risk. What scoring method are you going to use to decide the which risks are high, medium, or low? So that's something you're going to come up with as a team. You're going to talk about your escalation process. Which risks should be escalated and when, and what does that process look like? This PMI doesn't specifically call this out, but I think this is a really good place because when you're escalating, you're typically escalating a risk or an issue, right? So to me, the risk management plan is a really good place to define this risk escalation process and who should these specific risks be escalated to. Okay. All right. So the next step is to identify all the potential threats that may potentially happen on a project. So once you're doing this, my suggestion is that you have a starting point. Don't walk into this risk identification meeting with a blank piece of paper. Okay. You would think that, and maybe it's just my experience, but you would think that people coming to the table and talking about their problems and issues would be a no-brainer. That you're going to walk away from this meeting with so many issues that could potentially happen that this is going to end up being a 2-page document. But from my experience, having this meeting, it's almost like pulling teeth to try to get any potential threats or risks that may potentially come up. So it takes a while to do. And when you have this meeting, you want to make sure that you have cross functional teams available: your developers, your testers, your BAs, your Scrum Master, um, whoever. But the cross functional teams, pull them together from each area, and you guys sit in a room and knock it out. Now, how you knock it out is totally up to you. It's totally up to um, the attention span of the people that you're working with. Now, I have a short attention span. I can pretty much, you can get maybe an hour, 2 hours out of me. Some people you can get more. So, depending on the size of the project, I've had these risk identification meetings where it may have taken an hour. And I've had some where it took maybe 3 meetings so that we can totally flush out our risk management plan. It all depends. So You have to really think about that. Do you want to keep people in a room, lock them up, and get it done in a day? Or is it something you want to do over a period of several days, in smaller increments to not overwhelm people? All right. So once you have this meeting, all you're doing is, if you look at this template and you look at maybe the first five rows here, columns, you want to, I'm sorry, not the first four, the first five here. You want to identify any potential threats or risks that may potentially happen during the project from each area, whether it's and you want to categorize those risks as well. So whether it's a resource risk, it's a technical risk, a business risk, a testing risk, you want to categorize them and you want to identify what is the risk. Now, when you're writing your risk, one of the best practices is to use if and then. If then. If this happens, then this will be the consequence. Now, I really want to talk about this and drive this home because when I was a program manager and I would review a lot of the PMs, uh, risks that they are looking to actually present in like a project status report meeting or maybe a steering meeting, it just didn't read very well. It was missing the punch. Now, especially when you're presenting this to executives and you need a decision, you need a response, you need more funding. It's your job as a project manager to influence and try to influence that executive to give you what you need to get the job done. So your then statement has to be succinct, but yet it has to pack power. They have to really understand the so what. Why should I care? That's very important. Why should I even care? If this happens, what I mean, what does it matter to me? And it's your job to clearly articulate that. Okay. So if you look at the example I have here, this is a resource risk. And then the description, if claims developers are pulled to work on other projects due to shortage of developers, here's the impact. Then the ability to deliver logic changes for claims on schedule is in jeopardy. Now, the reason I have this in bold here is that most project managers, they stop right here and it drives me insane. They stop here and I'm looking at this and you're asking me to give you an additional $90,000. Okay, it'll be in jeopardy. But what does that mean to me? Why should I care? I get it. There may be some schedule slippage. Figure it out. But drive it home and you want to really make sure that you're articulating the impact on the end user, the customer, the person who's using this product, your stakeholders. That's what you want to drive home. The business impact. Those are the things that you want to drive home. So I further added a little bit more verbiage here. This act, then the if the claims developers are pulled to work on other projects due to a shortage of developers right now, then the ability to deliver logic changes for claims on schedule is in jeopardy. This activity is on the critical path, which means, what does that mean? If it's on the critical path, that means if any activity on the critical path moved out one day, your entire project would move out one day. So, which means you're going to be one day late. So it's on the critical path and it will delay the entire project by 5 weeks. Okay, now if I'm an executive, I sit up because now I'm interested. Okay, so it's not a couple of days. You're saying that we have this product committed to users, to people who are going to use this, and we've committed to have this done by October. So you're saying that now we won't be able to deliver this until sometime in November or December. All right, that's one. Customers would not be able to submit a claim for payment, and if a claim is submitted, the claim would be 20% higher because some type of calculation error than expected. It would cause customer dissatisfaction. Okay, now you have my attention. This is critical. I don't want any of my customers to be dissatisfied. I definitely don't want them paying 20% more, right? If that happened to you, I would be very upset. Now you have my attention. What do you need? Okay, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But now um, you have my attention, and I'm very much willing to give you what you need to make sure that this is delivered on time. Okay, I just want to talk about that. To me, that's very important. So during your risk identification meeting, again, you're going to talk about your risk category, bring up the risk, and then you're going to describe the impact. And the impact should be a description of impact of the project objective. Okay. All right. So that's all you're doing during the risk identification. Once you've done your risk identification, the next thing to do, once you're done with your risk identification, the next thing to do is to come up with is to qualify your risk. And qualifying the risk is really nothing more than it's subjective based on expert judgment from your team. So really all you're doing is prioritizing the risk, whether it's a low, medium, or high risk, and you're also providing the impact. And once you have your probability score as well as your impact score, then you come up with an overall risk score. And what you're looking to get out of this is you really want to pull and identify all of your high risks. That's what you really want once you're done with this. And then I'll explain that in a minute. Okay. So if you look at the risk register here, move this over a little bit. So when we put together the risk management plan, we talked about the scoring method we're going to use to assess our risk. So what we came up with is we're going to go between 10 to 100%. I believe it's 10 to 30% would be a low risk, 40 to 70% would be a medium risk. Anything between 70 and 100% would be considered a high risk. That's what we've determined. So for this particular risk, the likelihood, since we know there's a shortage of claims developers, it's a known risk. We need to account for it, right? We need to plan for it. So the probability of this happening is pretty high. It hasn't happened yet, but it's pretty high. So we gave it a probability score of 90%. Now, what's the impact if this happens? We talked about it. The impact is pretty big. We have dissatisfied customers. It's going to be 20% higher, and it's going to push the claims payment is going to be 20% higher, and it's going to push our project end date out by 5 weeks. That's the impact. What does that sound like to you? The impact sounds pretty big to me, right? It's a high impact. So we're going to give it a impact score of 95%. Our overall impact score is 93%. So we actually, at this point, know what our probability is, we know our impact, and we know our overall risk score. And based on that, this is a high risk. Okay. All right. So during your risk, once you're qualifying your risk, this is what you're going to do. Now, the next step is to quantify your risk. And I do want to call out that quantifying your risk, typically, this is pretty much as far as people go. A lot of people do not quantify their risk because sometimes requires some statistical modeling. You have all these other tools that you can use to quantify your risk. But to keep it simple, all I want to know when I'm quantifying my risk is what is the cost impact on my cost, and what is the impact on my schedule. I want to quantify that. All right. So when I met with my team and we talked about this risk, I asked, okay, so what are we going to do? How much is it going to cost? We had already decided that our contingency and mitigation strategy, which I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. We said that our risk responses that we're going to just, um, I'm sorry, not accept, we're going to mitigate this risk. And how are we going to mitigate this risk is we're going to hire a contractor who will be assigned 100% to the project. So we get in front of the risk. We don't have to worry about him being pulled off our project to work on other projects. He's solely dedicated to our project. How much is it going to cost to hire a contractor developer? $90,000. Okay. So in order for us to mitigate this risk, we're going to hire a contractor developer and we're going to pay $90,000. I'm still quantifying. So this is my cost impact. All right. Now, one thing that I really don't see a lot of people doing is that schedule impact. Okay. One of the things you want to look at is this activity on my critical path? Yes or no? Because if it is on the critical path, as I mentioned earlier, if the project is late by one day, the entire project is going to be late by one day. If it's not on the critical path, there's something that we have called float, which means you may have a little bit more time to get the work done because it's not on the critical path. You may have an additional 5 days, 10 days, but you want to do that type of schedule analysis to determine how long is it going to take to if this risk actually happens. So we talked and we said, okay, it's on the critical path one. All right, so let's figure out how many days is it going to, what was the impact in days? If it's impacted, if our schedule is impacted, how long will it take for us to find another developer or to backfill that position so that we can finish our work? And it was decided that it would take 5 weeks, which is 25 days. Because you got to get the person in, you got to get them trained, you got to get the person on board, get them up to speed. And hopefully this person is good at what he does. Okay. So it's going to take 5 weeks. Now, all of this, everything I just talked about is a quantitative risk analysis. It gets deeper than this. But at the most elementary level, this is what's going to happen. Now, the other thing that I do want to point out is you see I have here cost if risk is recognized is $90,000. And you see here my monetary value of the risk is $83,000. Now, this is based on the risk score. So if it is a low risk, then it's going to take the cost of that risk of hiring a new person and it's going to multiply by that risk score. So if it's low, it's going to be times 10%, which means we have to put aside $9,000. Now, why I think this is important is if you do this well and you're working with leadership, what'll happen is you say, okay, we've come up with our budget. We got all of our estimates. We know what our budget is. Now, based on our risk analysis, we've come up with these 10 risks that we need that are considered high risk and that will be a detriment to the outcome of the project. We need to put aside an additional $83,000 in case this risk happens. Okay, so if you have this money put aside, if the risk happens, then you should be able, when you go to leadership and you say, okay, I need money so that I can hire a new consultant, I need $90,000. They already have $83,000 put to the side. It's just a matter of coming up with the rest of the money to hire that contractor, which is really minimal. Okay, so you have this money put to the side. It's a lot easier to get the money, and if you don't need it, that money could be given to another project. Okay, all right. The other thing I do want to bring up before I move on is the schedule impact. You want to, if it is considered a risk with a high impact and especially a high probability of happening, you have to somehow incorporate that lost time into your schedule. Okay. You have to make sure that you incorporate that lost time into your schedule. So if it's going to be a 25-day slippage, somewhere, somehow, you have to add 25 days in your schedule to be able to address this risk. All it means, if it doesn't happen and you don't need it, you'll finish early. But to not have it there, it just isn't a good idea. You want to make sure that you're covering yourself from a cost perspective as well as a schedule perspective. Okay. All right. The last two things I want to talk about is your risk response. As we just saw within the risk register that we just reviewed, I have different risk responses. Okay. And this is something that you're going to come up with your team. So if A happens, this is the impact. This is how we're going to respond to it. So the first thing you want to do, you have four options. Either you can avoid a risk, you can transfer a risk, you can mitigate a risk, or you can just accept it. Now, if you avoid or eliminate the risk, basically what you're saying is that we need to do something so that this risk, we totally eliminate the risk and it doesn't happen. We cannot absorb this risk. If we do, it is going to impact the project's overall objective. And we're going to be late. We have this committed. We have people waiting for it. They've already paid, and this isn't going to work. So you just come up with a totally different approach so that you can avoid the risk altogether. The second risk response is transfer. When you transfer the risk, all you're doing is moving the risk elsewhere. You're saying instead of us absorbing this risk, we're going to buy insurance to help mitigate this. We're going to bring in a supplier who's more skilled and they've done more projects on this level to help absorb the risk. So that's transfer. Mitigation is the most common. That's basically just developing a plan to reduce the consequence and or the likelihood of a risk event happening. Okay. The consequence and or the likelihood of a risk happening. So you're just coming up with a plan to soften the blow. If this happens, here's our plan for addressing it, and you already know what to do. The last one is accepting a risk. And this is basically just, okay, if it happens, there's nothing we can do about it. We just got to let it happen. And you just come up with a contingency plan for that. Okay. Just determine the contingency plan, document it, and then you're golden. Okay. So you've met with your team. We've talked about the different risk management processes. We've gone through all of those. We talked about the pros and cons of doing risk management. So the last thing I want to talk about is how do you communicate these project risks? Do you keep them in a risk register and you never share them? What do you do? So one of the things you want to do as part of your risk management plan is to figure out the escalation process. How do you escalate? What's the impact of a risk should drive the impact of a risk to drive the escalation. So if you have a risk and the impact is high, then that's something that definitely should be escalated. It definitely should be escalated. Um, and in this case, you may need executive sponsor support to make a decision, to get additional funding, or whatever may be. Now, sometimes this can come in the form of a change request. Okay, here's the change request. Here's how much additional funding we need. We know this is going to happen. We know it's going to impact our schedule by so many days. And this is what we need to make this risk go away. So you have your change request as part of your process of communicating project risk. And then finally, you present it during your status report. It should be on your status report. It should be visible. If it isn't documented, it doesn't exist. If it's in your head, who cares? It doesn't exist. You have to make sure that these risks, especially those big ones, that they're documented and you have a plan. Okay. Now, if you bring a risk to executive leadership and you've clearly articulated the so what, and you still don't get the additional funding, if nothing else, you get to document here's a decision. We didn't get this additional funding. It's going to impact our project by 5 weeks. So when that happens, they can't look at you and say, why is this project 5 weeks late and it's costing us an additional $90,000? You already have that document. Okay. So is you just covering yourself, making sure that you're being professional, making sure that you're being thorough, making sure that you're giving your executive stakeholders and sponsors the right level of data so that they can make clear and informed decisions. Okay. And the other thing I want to bring up is your risk register. You don't fill it out on that one day during your risk management and then just lock it away and don't touch it, put it in your document repository and it's just there. No. It is a living document that you are going to update for during the duration of the project. You should visit it at a minimum weekly to make sure that none of these risks are about to materialize. Okay? At least weekly, and make sure that you provide update, make sure that you continue to add to it, and then you're golden from there. Okay? All right. So, that's all I want to talk about today with risk management. Again, I'm Xavier Billingsley. And hey, if you disagree with anything that I've said, or this is an open community, if you want to add to it, if you have more to add, I'm more than happy to listen. Go to my YouTube channel and you can add it to the comment box and we can dialogue about it. Okay? All right, guys. Well, thanks for joining. And I will talk to you again next week. Bye bye.